It was an ordinary morning at the airport. The hum of conversations, the soft clink of luggage being wheeled across the floor, and the occasional announcement over the loudspeakers filled the air. Flight 214 was ready for departure, bound for a city several hours away. Passengers boarded the plane, and the crew quickly moved into action, helping people find their seats, stowing away carry-ons, and making sure everything was in order for the flight. Among the passengers was a boy, no older than 10, with his mother. The flight attendants noticed them right away. The boy was sitting quietly in his seat, but there was something about him that caught their attention. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange feeling that seemed to hang in the air around him. The flight attendants, doing their usual checks, tried to push the uneasy feeling out of their minds. There was no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. The boy looked normal, and his mother appeared calm and collected as they settled into their seats. Still, there was an odd energy about the situation. It was as though everyone around him was unaware of a growing sense of discomfort. As the plane's engines roared to life and the aircraft slowly made its way down the runway, the flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Everything seemed to be moving along as usual. But as the plane climbed higher into the sky, something about the boy continued to bother one of the flight attendants, a woman named Sarah. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something unusual about him, something that made her feel unsettled. At first, it was just a slight unease. Sarah kept doing her work, taking orders from passengers, checking on people, and making sure everyone was comfortable. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She couldn't shake the image of the boy, and the strange sense that something was wrong. Every time she passed by him, she couldn't help but glance down at his feet. It was odd, but she kept noticing them. The boy wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just sitting there, his feet barely touching the floor. Sarah thought it was strange because the boy looked like he should have been able to reach the floor comfortably. She paused for a moment, wondering if he was just sitting awkwardly, but then the feeling of discomfort began to grow stronger. Maybe I'm just tired, Sarah thought to herself, trying to shake off the nagging feeling. But even as she walked down the aisle, she couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Something about the way he moved, the way he sat, made Sarah feel like something wasn't right. As she went about her duties, she couldn't help but glance over at the boy one more time. This time, she noticed something even stranger. His feet didn't seem to touch the floor the way they should. It was as though his posture was all wrong. She felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Why does he look so different? She whispered to herself, her heart racing slightly. The boy's feet, which had seemed ordinary at first, now looked oddly out of place. Sarah couldn't ignore it any longer. She decided to speak to another crew member about her concerns. Something was definitely off, and it was more than just the boy's feet. Something in the air was telling her that she needed to pay attention. As the flight continued, the airplane hummed steadily through the sky. The flight attendants moved about the cabin, checking on passengers and making sure everyone was comfortable. But Sarah couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled deep within her. It was more than just an odd thought. It was a constant, nagging feeling, one that made her glance over at the boy again and again. She wasn't the only one who noticed him. Another flight attendant, Mark, was in the galley preparing snacks when he noticed the same thing. The boy seemed different from the others. At first, Mark had thought it was just his imagination, but as time went on, he couldn't deny the feeling that something about the boy was off. Mark had been a flight attendant for years and had seen all kinds of things on planes. Some passengers were nervous flyers, some were rude, and some were even ill. But this was different. It wasn't the boy's behavior, it was the way he seemed to carry himself. He didn't move the same way as the other children, and there was something unnerving about his quiet, almost still presence. As Mark walked down the aisle with a drink cart, he found himself once again looking at the boy, who was still sitting in his seat. The boy's feet were still not touching the floor, just hovering slightly above it. This was the moment that unsettled Mark the most. He had tried to ignore it, but now it seemed impossible. Something in his gut told him that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Why would a child, who appeared perfectly healthy, be sitting in a way that made no sense? The boy's feet were clearly not resting on the floor like they should have been, and it made Mark feel uneasy. He tried to distract himself by offering drinks to the other passengers, but he couldn't help glancing back at the boy. At one point, the boy looked up at Mark, his eyes wide and glassy, but with an expression that seemed distant, almost as if he wasn't really seeing him. Mark quickly looked away, unsure of why he had felt so uncomfortable. It was as though the boy had stared into him, and for a split second, Mark felt a chill in his bones. Maybe he's just a quiet child, Mark thought, trying to reason with himself. After all, some kids were shy or quiet, especially on long flights. But still, he couldn't ignore the feeling growing inside him. A feeling that there was something important about the boy that he wasn't understanding. Sarah had been watching from a distance. Mark had passed by her earlier, looking more troubled than usual. She knew he was a veteran flight attendant, someone who had seen all kinds of odd situations. If he was feeling uneasy, then it wasn't just her imagination. Something was definitely wrong. When their eyes met across the cabin, Sarah couldn't keep it to herself any longer. She walked over to Mark, trying to sound casual but her voice betraying her concern. "Do you notice anything strange about the boy?" she asked quietly. Mark looked at her, his face serious. "I don't know," he replied, glancing back at the boy. "But there's something about him. I can't explain it." They both fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. They both felt it now, the uncomfortable energy surrounding the boy. And for the first time, they both began to wonder if there was something more they should be doing. The flight continued smoothly, but the uneasy feeling among the crew members only grew stronger. As Sarah walked down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers, she couldn't help but keep an eye on the boy. His strange behavior was becoming more noticeable. It wasn't that he was misbehaving or causing any trouble. He just seemed off. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural. He remained unusually still, like he was in some kind of trance, and his eyes never seemed to focus on anything. Sarah tried to keep her mind on her work. She had a job to do after all, and there were passengers to take care of. But every time she passed by the boy, she found herself glancing over at him. Something about his silence, the way he sat frozen in his seat, was unsettling. It was as though the world around him didn't matter. He wasn't talking, he wasn't fidgeting. He was just there. Mark, who had been quietly observing him as well, was starting to feel the weight of his concern. Something in his gut told him that this wasn't just a typical strange behavior from a child. There was something deeper going on. He had been in the air for years and had seen all kinds of unusual passengers, but this was different. It felt as though the boy didn't belong on the plane. Mark's instincts were screaming at him to do something, but he didn't know what. As Sarah and Mark continued with their duties, the other flight attendants, Emma and James, began to notice the strange atmosphere too. They had seen children who were shy or nervous, even some who cried or misbehaved. But this was different. They could feel the tension growing as well. James leaned in close to Emma, his voice low and concerned. "Have you noticed the boy? Something's not right with him." Emma nodded, her eyes quickly scanning the aisle to make sure the boy wasn't looking. "I've been watching him too," Emma said. "It's like he's not even here. He's just staring like he's in another world." The conversation didn't last long before Sarah and Mark came together again, their concern for the boy only deepening. The unease had spread among the crew like wildfire. Each flight attendant exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do next. "I don't know what's going on with him," Sarah whispered, "but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." Mark agreed. "I keep thinking about his feet. Why won't he put them down? It's not like he's too small to reach the floor. It doesn't make sense." As they spoke, they could feel the tension growing. It was no longer just a matter of noticing strange behavior. It felt like something was brewing, something they couldn't quite explain but could feel in the pit of their stomachs. And when the boy's eyes met theirs from across the aisle, it sent a cold shiver down their spines. His gaze was distant, unfocused, but it felt as though he could see straight through them. The crew was growing more uneasy by the minute. They couldn't ignore their instincts any longer. Something was wrong, and they had to do something about it. But what could they do? They couldn't just stop the plane for no reason. They had no idea that this uneasy feeling was just the beginning. The tension in the cabin was about to escalate, and the flight crew would soon be forced to make a decision that would change everything. The flight was moving along smoothly in the skies, but the feeling of unease had not gone away. If anything, it was growing stronger. The flight attendants exchanged worried looks as they continued with their duties. But no matter how they tried to focus on their work, their attention kept drifting back to the boy. Sarah could feel her heart beating faster with each passing minute. She had seen plenty of strange things during her time as a flight attendant. The occasional nervous flyer, the child who couldn't sit still, and even the occasional medical emergency. But this was different. This wasn't about a scared passenger or a restless child. It felt as though something more sinister was in the air. The boy, still sitting quietly in his seat, didn't seem to notice the growing attention from the crew. His feet were still hovering just above the floor. The way he sat, so rigid and still, felt almost unnatural. Sarah's thoughts raced. Why wouldn't he move? Why didn't he seem like the other children she had seen? She couldn't understand it. At one point, Sarah found herself walking past him again, this time with a drink cart in tow. She couldn't resist stealing another glance at him. As she did, her eyes caught his feet. They were still hovering above the floor, like he was floating. A strange chill ran down her spine, and a feeling of dread washed over her. She suddenly felt like she needed to do something, but what could she do? It was then that Sarah's thoughts shifted. She had to speak to someone. She couldn't keep ignoring the feelings that were creeping up inside her. This was no longer just a strange situation. It was a growing emergency in her mind. She needed to act. With a deep breath, Sarah made her way to the cockpit, her steps quick but measured. As she approached the door, she knocked lightly, but her knuckles felt cold against the metal. The captain, a calm and experienced man named Captain Reynolds, opened the door, surprised to see her. "Is everything okay, Sarah?" he asked, his voice steady. I need to talk to you about something," Sarah said, her voice quieter than she intended. "It's about a passenger, a boy." Captain Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" Sarah hesitated, trying to gather her thoughts. She couldn't explain it fully, but she had to make him understand. "Something about him feels wrong. He's not acting like a normal child. He's too still. His feet, they're not even touching the floor. It's like he's not really here." Captain Reynolds listened carefully, his expression serious. He had heard of strange situations on flights before, but this one felt different. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "All right, I understand," he said, standing up. "I'll take a look." Sarah followed him back to the cabin. As they passed by the boy, Captain Reynolds took a moment to glance at him. The boy didn't look up, his gaze still distant and unfocused. It was the same unsettling feeling Sarah had been experiencing. The pilot turned back to Sarah. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Let's take this seriously." He immediately spoke into the intercom, alerting the rest of the crew to be on high alert. The tension in the air was palpable as the crew members listened closely, wondering what would happen next. The decision had been made. The situation was too strange to ignore. The plane needed to land, and they needed to act fast. Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. She had done the right thing by speaking up, but now they were heading into the unknown. What would they find when they landed? And more importantly, what had been causing the strange feelings on board the plane? As the plane continued its journey, the crew was on edge. Every movement, every sound, seemed louder than usual. The unease that had begun with Sarah's first observation about the boy had now spread throughout the entire crew. Each of them, in their own way, was trying to make sense of what was happening. Sarah walked up and down the aisles, keeping a careful eye on the boy, who remained as still as ever. His posture was stiff, and his eyes seemed locked on something only he could see. No matter how much Sarah tried to shake off the nagging feeling in her gut, she couldn't. It was like something was pushing her to act, but she wasn't sure how to do it without causing a scene. Meanwhile, Mark and the other flight attendants were having their own quiet conversation in the galley. They exchanged their thoughts on the boy, all agreeing that something was wrong. Emma, who had been working for several years, was the first to speak up. "I've never seen anything like this," Emma said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "The boy's behavior is so strange. It's like he's not really there. He's not interacting with anyone or anything. It's almost like he's in a trance." "I agree," Mark said. "I don't think it's just nerves. I've seen kids who are shy or scared on flights. But this is different. It's like something is keeping him from moving or reacting like a normal child." James, the newest crew member, had been listening quietly to the conversation. He felt his heart rate increase as he thought back to the moments when he had walked past the boy. He had noticed the same strange feeling, but it had been hard to explain. Now, hearing the others talk, he knew that he wasn't imagining things. "I don't think we can just ignore this anymore," James said, his voice serious. "If we don't do something, what if something happens? What if we're missing something important?" Sarah, who had been walking by, overheard the conversation and stopped. She could feel the weight of their words settle over her. The crew was right. The boy wasn't just a nervous child. There was something deeply unsettling about his presence. She could feel it in her bones. And with the decision now clearly forming in their minds, Sarah spoke up. "I think we need to tell the pilot," she said quietly. "This is beyond just being a little strange. We can't ignore it. Something's not right with that boy. We need to get him off this plane." The others nodded in agreement. The tension was thick as they realized that the only solution was to land the plane early. They couldn't wait any longer. Something inside them told them that waiting could be dangerous. This wasn't just a hunch anymore. The boy's behavior was not just odd, it was a warning. Mark was the one who took the responsibility of contacting the cockpit. He grabbed the intercom and called Captain Reynolds, his voice steady despite the rising fear inside him. "Captain, we need to land the plane. There's something wrong with one of the passengers. We can't ignore it anymore." The pilot's response was swift and serious. "I'll start the procedures to land. Prepare the cabin. We're going to make an unscheduled stop." As the plane began to turn toward an emergency landing, the flight attendants moved quickly and quietly to make sure everything was in order. They knew that this wasn't just about getting the boy off the plane. It was about ensuring the safety of everyone on board. The air was thick with tension as they prepared for an unknown situation. Sarah's heart raced as she glanced back at the boy, still sitting in his seat, his eyes glazed over. She didn't know what was wrong with him, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, they needed to act quickly. The plane was about to land, and they were about to face whatever had been causing the strange feelings. The plane started its descent, slowly turning away from its original course toward the nearest airport. The sudden change in direction caused a ripple of confusion among the passengers. The flight attendants, however, remained calm and composed, masking the tension that was quickly building in the cabin. Sarah, Mark, Emma, and James moved with purpose, each of them keenly aware of the gravity of the situation. As Sarah moved through the aisles, she couldn't help but look back at the boy one more time. He hadn't moved. His feet were still hovering above the floor, as if some invisible force was holding them up. His eyes were locked in a distant stare, and the same eerie silence followed him wherever he went. It was hard to explain, but everything about him felt out of place. Mark, who had made the call to Captain Reynolds, was already at the front of the cabin, checking on the passengers. He didn't want to cause any unnecessary alarm, But he couldn't ignore the fact that something was wrong. He had seen plenty of nervous passengers before, but this was beyond nerves. The air felt thick with tension. Back in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was listening carefully as Mark had explained the situation. The pilot's face remained serious as he made the decision to land the plane. His years of experience told him that something wasn't right, even if he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Whatever the crew had noticed, it was enough to make him take action. He keyed the intercom and spoke in a calm voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're making an unscheduled stop for safety reasons. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll be landing shortly." The announcement did little to calm the passengers, who exchanged confused glances. The sudden change in the flight's course had everyone wondering what was going on. Sarah, passing by the aisles once again, noticed a few passengers glancing up at her with questions in their eyes. She forced a smile, trying to maintain control. "Everything's fine," she reassured them, though she felt anything but calm inside. As the plane continued its descent, the cabin grew quieter. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, and every creak of the aircraft seemed louder than usual. Sarah's mind raced. Was she overreacting? Was it possible that there was nothing to worry about after all? She tried to convince herself that she was just imagining things, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't just her. The entire crew felt it. They couldn't ignore their instincts. Captain Reynolds, now in full control of the situation, looked out the cockpit window as the plane neared the runway. The airport was getting closer, and he could already see emergency vehicles positioned on the tarmac. The airport had been alerted to the situation, and they were prepared for whatever they might find when the plane touched down. The pilot felt a sense of urgency as he lined up the aircraft for a quick, safe landing. Back in the cabin, Sarah watched the boy one last time. His expression hadn't changed. He was still motionless, staring into space. As the plane touched down, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The worst was almost over. They were about to find out what had been causing the strange feelings on the plane, and finally, the mystery would be resolved. But as the plane came to a complete stop, Sarah realized that the answers they were hoping for might not come so easily. Something about the boy had already changed everything, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The plane touched down with a soft thud, its wheels skimming the tarmac as the engine slowed to a hum. Sarah felt a small sense of relief as the aircraft finally came to a halt. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable, and for a moment, everything seemed still. The flight attendants moved quickly, ensuring the passengers were securely in their seats, and everyone was prepared for what came next. Outside, the emergency vehicles were visible in the distance, their lights flashing brightly against the fading afternoon sky. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars lined the runway, waiting for the plane to come to a full stop. The passengers, unaware of the growing concern inside the cabin, were still seated, some nervously glancing out the windows, wondering what was happening. Sarah felt her pulse quicken again as the cabin door opened. The emergency crews would soon board the plane, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She turned to look at the boy one more time. He was still seated, motionless, staring straight ahead with that same, distant look in his eyes. His feet still hovered slightly above the floor. It was as if nothing had changed. Mark, Emma, and James had gathered near the front of the plane, their faces tense as they watched the emergency personnel approach. They exchanged worried glances, each of them wondering what the outcome would be. "You did the right thing," Mark said quietly to Sarah, his voice filled with both relief and uncertainty. "We had to land. We couldn't risk anything happening." Sarah nodded but felt no comfort in his words. Something deep inside told her that this was far from over. They had acted, but they still didn't know what was going on. She could feel her heart racing again, the weight of the unknown heavy in her chest. The door to the plane opened, and the emergency crew quickly moved inside. They were calm but efficient, looking over the passengers as they walked down the aisles. The flight attendants stepped aside to let them through, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as the team approached the boy. She stood back, watching them as they knelt beside the child. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged woman, looked up at the mother sitting next to the boy. "Is everything okay with him?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. The mother, who had remained quiet throughout the flight, gave a small, nervous nod. "Yes, he's just been a little quiet," the mother said, her voice wavering. "But he's fine." The paramedic looked at the boy, her brows furrowing. "He hasn't moved since we boarded," she noted, glancing at Sarah. "He hasn't reacted to anything. And his feet," she paused, looking at the boy's feet, still hovering just above the floor. The paramedic's face grew more serious. She leaned closer to the boy and gently touched his shoulder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, to everyone's surprise, the boy blinked, slowly. His eyes seemed to focus for the first time in hours, and he slowly turned his head toward the paramedic. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice soothing. The boy's lips parted slightly, and in a weak, trembling voice, he spoke. I don't know," he whispered. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The boy's reaction was not what anyone had expected. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a glimmer of something that seemed almost human. She felt the chill in her spine lessen slightly, but the unease remained. The boy was still strange, and whatever had been causing his unusual behavior wasn't over. The paramedic looked up at the crew, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "We need to get him checked immediately," she said. "There's more going on here than just a quiet child." As the crew stood back, waiting for the next step, Sarah felt a sense of unease deepen. Whatever was happening, they had no idea what was coming next. The boy's strange behavior was just the beginning of something far bigger. And now, they were about to find out what it truly was. The paramedic gently helped the boy to his feet, supporting him as he wobbled slightly. His eyes, still distant but now more aware, darted around the cabin as if he was just waking up from a long sleep. His mother, who had been quiet the entire flight, seemed relieved but still on edge. She looked at the flight attendants, then at the paramedic, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. "Is he all right?" Sarah asked, unable to hide the concern in her voice. She had watched the boy for hours, and she still didn't understand what was going on. She could tell that he was no longer as distant, but there was something unsettling in the way he behaved. The paramedic gave Sarah a quick glance, still holding onto the boy's shoulder as he steadied himself. "It's hard to say right now. He's awake, but something's off. He doesn't seem to remember much." The boy, now standing with the paramedic's help, looked around the cabin. His eyes were wide, but his expression was blank, as though he didn't recognize where he was. The paramedic tried to speak to him gently. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked. The boy hesitated for a moment, his lips barely moving. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice shaking. The response sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. The boy's lack of memory, combined with his strange behavior, was more than just confusing. It felt as though he was stuck between two worlds, not fully present, not fully absent. His mother looked at him with a mix of fear and confusion, but didn't say anything. The emergency crew exchanged glances. This was no longer just a simple case of a quiet child. Something was clearly wrong. The paramedic motioned for another team member to approach, signaling for them to take the boy to the medical station. "We need to get him checked out immediately," she said, her voice firm but calm. "There's something in his condition that needs closer attention." The crew, who had been standing by, silently watching the unfolding events, began to feel the weight of the situation. This was no longer just a strange moment or a mysterious passenger. This was something far more serious. The boy's memory loss, combined with his odd behavior during the flight, left everyone with more questions than answers. The paramedic moved toward the door, helping the boy toward the emergency vehicles waiting on the runway. Sarah, Mark, Emma, and James watched them go, their thoughts heavy with unanswered questions. "Do you think we'll ever know what happened?" Mark asked, his voice low, filled with concern. "I don't know," Sarah replied softly, still shaken by the boy's behavior. "But I feel like we've only scratched the surface of something much bigger." As the emergency crew escorted the boy off the plane, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery was far from over. They had done what they needed to do. They had acted on their instincts and landed the plane to ensure everyone's safety. But there was so much more to this strange situation. Why had the boy behaved that way? What had caused him to lose his memory? And most importantly, what was the story behind his odd behavior? The plane's crew watched the emergency vehicles disappear into the distance, still unsure of what they had just witnessed. Sarah looked out the window, her thoughts racing. She didn't know if they would ever find out what had happened, but she had a feeling that the story was far from over. There was a mystery here that no one could yet explain, and whatever it was still out there. The day after the plane landed, Sarah, Mark, Emma, and James sat together in a small break room, the sounds of the airport busy outside. The tension from the day before still hung in the air, and each of them found it hard to focus on anything else. They had all watched the emergency crew take the boy off the plane. And now, hours later, there were still no answers. "I keep thinking about it," Mark said, his voice tired. "What happened to that kid? Where did he go after they took him away?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her hands resting on the table. "It's strange. The way he acted. It wasn't just that he was quiet. He looked like he was trapped in some way. Like he wasn't fully himself." Emma nodded slowly. "I agree. It didn't feel like just a child being shy or scared. There was something wrong, something we couldn't see." James, the newest crew member, was deep in thought. And he didn't even know his own name. That's not normal. How could someone forget something like that? They were all thinking the same thing. There had to be an explanation. But no one had given them any answers. The emergency crew had taken the boy to the hospital for tests, but there had been no updates since then. No one had said a word about what had caused the boy's strange behavior or what had happened after he left the plane. "Do you think we'll ever find out?" Sarah asked quietly. Her mind kept replaying the moments when the boy had stared blankly ahead, his feet hovering above the floor, his silence more haunting than anything she'd ever witnessed. Mark sighed deeply. "I don't know. The whole situation feels so off. We did the right thing by landing the plane, but I can't help feeling like we're missing something. There has to be a bigger reason why we felt the way we did." Emma leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Maybe we're not meant to know. Maybe it's better that way. Sometimes, mysteries like this don't get solved." The boy's mother was acting strange, too. I noticed it when they left. She didn't seem as worried as she should have been. It was like she was hiding something. James raised an eyebrow. "You think there's more to this?" "I don't know," Emma said, her tone uncertain. But something felt off about her, too. Maybe they were involved in something. "I don't know," something that had nothing to do with the flight. The conversation fell quiet as they all processed the possibilities. They hadn't gotten any answers, but the mystery still weighed heavily on their minds. The more they thought about it, the stranger everything seemed. How could the boy have acted so distant? Why had he forgotten his own name? And why had no one explained what had happened after he left the plane? "I think we've done everything we can," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. "We acted on our instincts, and we made sure everyone was safe. That's all we could do." The others nodded in agreement, though the unanswered questions still lingered. Sarah could feel it in her gut. Something wasn't right, but they might never know the full story. The boy and his mother had disappeared into the mystery, and for all they knew, they might never cross paths again. As the crew stood to leave the break room, a sense of finality washed over them. They had done their part, but the mystery remained. They would never forget the strange boy on the plane, or the feeling that something much bigger was hidden just beneath the surface.